Good afternoon, everybody. Well, the last time I talked to you, last Monday, we had just found out some interesting things. Joel had finally been able to make contact with Louise Carter, and that was a good thing. And if you'll remember, from Louise, he learned there was something else personal on the property. He searched, and eventually he found that item, and it was a medallion. He took that medallion back to Chaseford and delivered it to the Chief Petrovic. And that's where today's story starts. Well, also at that time, Dr. Whittles had sent some items to the new forensics lab in Toronto to get them tested. There was a little bit of liquid left in one bottle, and he wanted that tested. So we have some interesting things to find out today. So here's what we find out. First of all, there's a meeting at the chief's office, and Dr. Whittles is present. And he says, I'll give you the abbreviated version of the report I've received from Toronto. He said, I'll start with the cups that were found some time ago. They were examined and tested thoroughly, but there wasn't enough residue to indicate what was in them. Those cups came off the counter. Louise Carter had probably had her drink from there. And then Constable Smith says, what about the whiskey bottle? What'd you find out about it? And Whittle says, well, one thing, we didn't find your fingerprints on it. Ha ha ha, that was a joke. And he said there are lots of prints, but they're of poor quality, and they really didn't learn much from that. Now for the wine bottle, said Dr. Whittles, that expensive wine. Now Dr. Whittles was looking serious. So everyone sitting at the table now and around the desk now knew that what he was about to say was important. He said there were two main components in the fluid that remained in the wine bottle. There was enough for testing. One of those components was indeed the excellent wine from the Krug Collection 1928. The other component was conium maculatum. Of course, everyone just didn't know what to say when they heard those two words. Frank, please translate that for us, said the chief. The common name, said Dr. Whittles, is poison hemlock. So she was poisoned, said Constable Irwin. Apparently so, said Whittles. He said, when they phoned me from Toronto, they were very excited. They had never come across anyone who had been deliberately poisoned previously in Canada from hemlock. He told me the only cases they were aware of were historical. It was commonly used by the Greeks for condemned prisoners. The most famous to die that way was Socrates. So indeed, this is a while ago. So now they had learned that she was poisoned and had learned what the poison was. So Chief Petrovic thanked Dr. Whittles, and he said, turned to the rest of them and said, now we have more important revelations to come. He turned to Detective O'Neill, who was also present at the meeting, and said, What do you have to tell us? O'Neill said, well, I brought something interesting with me back from London this morning. That medallion that young Franklin found cleaned up nicely. There's no name on the medallion, and that's a little bit of a disappointment, but it does have some significant information on it. It's awarded for outstanding achievement in botanical research of herbaceous biennial flowering plants of Ontario. Boy, that's a mouthful. We know these prestigious awards in the field of botany are only awarded to one person in Ontario each year. The great news is that there was a date on the medallion. This medallion was awarded in 1912. The award was to a botany professor who is currently at the University of Western Ontario, and the name of that man is Benjamin Frankel. Nobody said anything. They knew the last name. I know what you're thinking, said the chief. I have been in touch with Chief Rutherford in Ottawa, and we're in the process of verifying, if possible, that Bella Frankel and Benjamin Frankel are related. Detective O'Neill will be making arrangements for us to conduct an interview with Benjamin Frankel tomorrow. So two very important things have happened at that meeting. They found out the type of poison, and they found the name of the person on the medallion. So now there's going to be an interview tomorrow. That tomorrow, in this case, is Friday the 13th. So on that day, Chief Petrovic drove down to London, went to the police station there, and met Detective O'Neill so they could conduct the interview. As they walked down the hall toward the interview room, Chief Petrovic said, Detective O'Neill, did you notice today is Friday the 13th? Yes, said O'Neill. I think it's going to be a very unlucky day for someone. The two of them had about 15 minutes to chat before the interview. Benjamin Frankel had agreed in his phone call with Inspector O'Neill that he would go to the station for the interview. So he's a little bit late, but not a lot. Well, you know, I gave him the option. This is O'Neill talking to Petrovic. I gave him the option of we could either go to his home and conduct the interview or he could come down here. You know, he decided to come down here, and that always makes me a little uneasy because I think the suspect is hiding something. But we'll find a way to get into his home. You know, it might take a warrant, but they'll get there. But he said, I talked to my boss, the current head of detectives, and he said, I don't have enough yet for a warrant. So let's see what we find out in this interview. Now, they're getting ready for the interview, and they're talking to the desk sergeant, and he says, you know, we're going to have a professional-looking man. He's a professor from the University of Western Ontario. He'll be coming in here shortly for an interview. I want refreshments brought down to the interview room. And the desk sergeant looked at O'Neill and said, why, is he some kind of like very special guest? He's special, said Chief Petrovic. Sergeant, serve the tea as soon as you can and perhaps serve some cookies and come back 10 minutes later and collect our cups and saucers. I want Frankel's cup checked for fingerprints. Aha! Now we know why the refreshments. They'd only been back in the interview room for about 5 minutes when there was a rap on the door. The sergeant opened the door and allowed the other man to enter. Both of them introduced themselves to Benjamin Frankel. Mr. Frankel was tall, perhaps 6'3", with black hair, with touches of gray in it. He appeared to be healthy and in reasonably good condition. He seemed very confident, and one quick look was enough to convince the chief of police that he could easily be related to Bella. There were some striking family resemblances. But you have to check that out anyway. O'Neill was in charge of asking the questions, so he started the interview by saying that he understood that Mr. Frankel was a university professor and that his area of expertise was botany. Professor Frankel, he said, tell me about your educational career from the time you started university. So Frankel then went through his career and how he got to become an eminent botanist, and how his research for a PhD had resulted in the awarding of the prestigious medal in 1912. I'm a very focused person, he said. I was a special child. This is Frankel talking. I always pursued a goal and I always achieved it. And that's why I have had such an illustrious career. It was all the chief could do to restrain himself from interrupting while Frankel gave a monologue of how brilliant he truly was. A couple of times, the chief and Detective O'Neill exchanged glances. The word megalomaniac came to mind as they listened to the man. There was a rap on the door and the sergeant appeared. He had the tea and he had a plate of cookies. And so they paused and had some refreshments. Detective O'Neill continued the interview after that, and he started to talk about family relationships. And Benjamin Frankel explained that his parents had died many years ago from natural causes, just as he had become a professor at the University of Western Ontario. He explained he was the sole beneficiary of his parents' estate. They'd been very well-to-do people, and he still lived in the magnificent house that he'd grown up in. Did you have any brothers or sisters? Detective O'Neill inquired. I have a sister, Bella, Frankel replied. So far as I know, she's my only relative, and I don't know where she is. She's 5 years older than I am. She had no time for me when I was growing up. She was a difficult person and caused my parents a lot of grief. She was also extremely clever, but very manipulative. She was very untrustworthy. My parents cut her out of the will after she was involved in a number of questionable situations. When they disowned her, she threatened their lives. I'm still suspicious of the manner of my parents' deaths. The next question was, do you have a wife or any lady friends? Well, I've never married, Frankel replied. I don't have any romantic interest currently. There was only one woman I was ever seriously interested in, and that was many years ago. The woman had no interest in me, and since then I haven't really bothered with women. What was the name of the woman you had a romantic interest in? Chief Petrovic asked. Oh, her name was Louise Carter, said the professor. She was a very clever and interesting woman, but she had no use for me. When I persisted in my attention, she notified me that if necessary, she would have her brothers pay me a visit. Well, I'm a tall man, but her brothers are both bigger than I am, so I had no interest in meeting them, so I never spoke to her again. In answer to an earlier question, you mentioned the medal that you had won for outstanding research. That medal or medallion must have celebrated an important achievement. Do you have it currently displayed prominently in your home? Yes, Frankel replied. I keep it in a glass cabinet in my front foyer, along with some other important souvenirs, mementos. At this point, the chief reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He put the box on the table, he opened the box up, and the medallion was immediately visible to the three men. "Thank you very much," said the professor, surprised and pleased. "Where did you find it?" The chief was surprised at the reaction, but responded, "Well, I'm the chief of police in Chaseford, and the medallion is the reason I'm interviewing you. It was found near a cabin in a bush owned by the Carter family, not far from Chaseford." Frankel appeared astounded. "How did it get there?" he practically shouted, no longer calm and confident. Petrovic was a little baffled. He didn't expect Frankel's reaction to be one of confusion. "Were you there on Saturday, the 19th day of May?" the chief asked. Frankel looked at him, frowning and perplexed, and said, "No, I was at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. I've been there for the past year as a visiting professor. I returned to London at the end of July. I've only been home 2 weeks." Now Chief Petrovic was confused. He tried not to show it, but because they had both, he and the chief and detective had arrived at the interview convinced they had found the murderer. What was going on here? Just then there was a knock on the door of the interview room. O'Neill excused himself and went to the door. The sergeant was standing just outside the door. He handed a piece of folded notepaper to O'Neill. "I was told to deliver this, if possible, sir," he said. O'Neill glanced at the contents of the note, walked across the room, and handed it to Chief Petrovic. Petrovic quickly read the note and glanced up at O'Neill with a resigned expression on his face. The note read, "The fingerprints taken from the teacups today do not match any of the prints we have in the case file." Just as things in the interview were certainly beginning to fit together, there was a problem. They weren't fitting together the way that Chief Petrovic and O'Neill had thought they would. The two men thanked Benjamin Frankel for his time and excused him. Once he'd left the room, Chief Petrovic said, "Do you remember how excited we were yesterday about the discovery of the medallion and where it might lead?" "I certainly do," said O'Neill, "but it hasn't taken us where we thought we would go." "What do you think is Frankel as a suspect?" asked the chief. "He's an arrogant ass," O'Neill replied, "but I don't think he's our killer." "Nor do I," said the chief, "but it appears we're being led to believe that he is. It certainly seems that someone, and we both know who it is trying to frame him," said the detective. That's where today's reading ends. We'll see you next week.